Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary with a knife video for you. Today I've got a comparison. Now I will say in starting off, just ignore the background noise. I'll try to speak up a little bit so it's not much of an issue, but if you do hear something in the background, they are doing construction, you know, about two or three doors down from where I'm recording this. So let's go ahead and get started. The two knives I have are the Kershaw Blur. Very, very popular, almost sort of synonymous with Kershaw, and the Kershaw Knockout. Another very popular knife, maybe not nearly as associative. That is, you know, if you say Kershaw, many people think right away of the Blur. They don't necessarily think of the Knockout. The Blur is sort of the Griptilian or Para-2 or Tenacious or whatever of the Kershaw lineup. And I think with good reason. By the way, this is also the older knife, and I'm going to suggest, and I don't think I'm out of the way at all suggesting that a lot of the dimensions on this knife and a lot of the features of this knife influenced this one, okay? These are literally within 0.1 ounces of each other. They are exactly the same size. They are almost exactly the same blade length, and so very, very similar knives. They're also very close in price point. Now, if you shop around a little bit, the lowest prices I've found on Blurs are, you know, between $40 and $45. The lowest prices I've found on Knockouts are like $49, so around 50 bucks. So there is a bit of a price difference. It's not that big though, and in fact on Blade HQ today, I think this is like $67 and this is $65 or something like that. So they're very, very close in price point. And really, if you're looking at one, I think you can probably adjust up or down by $5 or so to lean toward the other one. So very close in price point, very close in size, very close in weight. So because of all that, I really wanted to compare these two. And the two I've got for you even have the same blade steel, 14C28N, which I absolutely love. Although there are variations of that in both of these, far more in the Blur, of course. We'll talk about that as we get down to the bottom in terms of what are some of the big differences that may be purchasing decision type differences. So let's start off with the Blur. I'll put the Knockout down for 1 second. Size and weight on the Kershaw Blur, 7 7/8 inches, 3.9 ounces. You've got 3 3/8 inches of blade, and it's a hollow grind with a recurve drop point blade. You know, where most people are well aware, this is a Ken Onion design. It's been a very, very popular knife. And of course, many, many people own and love the Kershaw Blur. Now, what about the Knockout? Well, the Knockout is also 7 7/8 inches. It is 3.8 ounces. So within 0.1 ounces, as I said, 3 3/4 inch blade. So the blade length, okay, is about 1/8 of an inch less, although the cutting edge is very, very similar and so close that it's not really fair to say the blade is longer on the Blur, although technically it is, okay? By the way, the Blur is 7/16 of an inch thick, and the Knockout is 3/8 of an inch thick. Anything else? Oh yeah, you can see, guys, that the handle design on the Knockout is different, right? It kind of comes up to this high point here. The Blur doesn't do that, and that does create about a 1/4 inch difference in handle length. Okay, so if I shut these two, you can see that the Knockout is a little bit longer. I'm kind of holding these butt to butt down there so you can see the top, and you can see that sort of protrusion here makes the Knockout just a little longer. All right, now we'll talk about other features as we go along, but in terms of size and weight, these are extremely, extremely similar. Now, in terms of how they carry in pocket, both are very comfortable in pocket, although the thinness on the Knockout is probably noticeable, as is the smoothness, although we're not really at that point in the discussion yet. Being as smooth as it is does make it go in and out of the pocket easier, but does have an impact on how grippy it is. And so lots of people have talked about that with the Blur and the grippiness, and how the pocket clip and that don't really go together that well. Okay, that'll be a different part of the discussion, but for now, just notice those sizes. Okay, very, very close together in size. Only difference being 0.1 ounces in weight, and a little bit of a difference in thickness, okay? So with the blur being a little bit thicker. Otherwise, they're basically the same in virtually every dimension within, except for blade length, which is so close it's not even worth noticing. Now, how about the blades on these? When we talk about knives, we like to kind of work our way from the top to the bottom. And so let's start off with the blur for the sake of simplicity. And since it's been around longer and is kind of the classic, we'll talk about it first as we go through. So the blade on this is a drop point with a hollow grind and a recurve. It's 14C28 blade steel. And this is a very, very capable EDC blade. It's a very good, even for, you know, food prep, if you're peeling an apple or cutting up a carrot or something, it's going to perform that task very, very well. The hollow grind makes it extremely thin behind the edge, makes this a very, very slicey knife, very, very proficient at any kind of slicing task because of the fact that that hollow grind allows material to get in, and then you can pull this deep belly kind of through whatever you're cutting. All right, so very slicey knife. It does have a very fair bit of strength. It's got a fine tip on it, but it does carry quite a bit of material out there to the end to add some strength and durability to that blade shape. So definitely a blade that I really like, blade that has performed very, very well for me in pretty much anything that I've ever had to do with it. What about the knockout? Well, guess what? Kind of the same thing. It is maybe a less, more traditional, just with those sort of this more gradual drop point, no recurve, very high flat grind. Essentially, this knife is going to perform like a full flat grind because it's such a high grind that really, you know, if you took this whole back part of the blade off, it would be about the same size as lots of other knives that are out there. So it performs a lot like a full flat grind. I will say that it also has a very thin cutting edge, okay? And it does slice as well quite nicely. There's a ton of belly on here. Notice there's only, you know, this smaller portion of straight edge, and then all of this is kind of belly, although it's not as abrupt of a belly. So it's not going to dig into material quite as well as the belly on the blur will do. Now, let me say that the way these two knives perform, and this is one of the reasons I prefer hollow grinds over flat grinds, is if you're cutting, let's say, cardboard with these two knives, this knife is actually going to bind more on the cardboard because of this. I'm going to use this little piece of paper as a straight edge. As you're cutting through, you know, you have the whole blade in contact with whatever the material is you're cutting. On the other hand, with the blur, you're cutting through that same cardboard, you actually have a void that's created between this whole section here where they don't touch. And so it greatly reduces the friction in that material that you're cutting through, okay? Very, very helpful little feature of a hollow grind, and that's going to be true of most hollow grinds, okay? So blade performance is very similar, cutting edge is very similar. The difference, I guess, is the recurve. Now, I know some people do not like recurve blades. They don't like sharpening them, and because of that, you may right away prefer the knockout. Now, I don't have a big issue sharpening recurve blades. I'm just fine with it, and so for me, the blade shape on the blur does win out just a bit, okay? It's not that I vastly prefer the blur, but I do like that hollow grind and that fairly prominent belly a little more than the full flat grind on the knockout. Now, what about lockup and deployment? Well, both of these have Kershaw's assist mechanism, and Kershaw definitely has the best assisted opening knives, in my opinion, but I think anyone's got to admit that these knives open fast, they're smooth, both of them, and this is one of the things that Kershaw is kind of famous for. A lot of their knives that are assisted, you can de-assist, and once they're de-assisted, you can actually feel just how well the knives are made, okay? You can really feel that even if you didn't have the assist, you could still flick this knife open. All the assist does is add a little bit to your effort, you know? So, what about it? Do you prefer a flipper or do you prefer the thumb stud deployment method? Now, many people have commented on how well done the the thumb studs are on the Kershaw Blur, and that is very true. They're extremely well done. They sort of just catch your finger just perfectly and allow you to really get a good grip and get a good push on that knife. Okay, there are studs on the Knockout. They're not nearly as comfortable as the studs on the Blur, but you do get the flipper. Okay, and the flipper, of course, adds a whole different dimension. Now, in terms of speed and in terms of smoothness, they're very, very similar. The thumb studs are definitely superior on the Blur. However, the Blur doesn't have a flipper at all. And so in this particular case, I kind of find, I don't know if it's that the flipper allows the force of my finger to add a little bit to the blade, but the Knockout does seem to come out with a little more authority than the Blur. And so for that reason, primarily, I'm going to give deployment to the Knockout, although not by a large margin. Now, what about lockup? Well, lockup on the Blur, of course, is by a liner lock, and the Knockout is a sub-frame lock. Which one is better? Which one is stronger? There's certainly more material, both more material to interface with the blade and more thickness of material in the sub-frame lock, and so likely there's going to be a little more strength involved there. Certainly it's a little more confidence inspiring. When you look at how well this engages into the blade tang, you go, hey, that's a good solid lockup. Not only that, but it feels incredibly solid. Now, the Blur also feels solid. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't, okay? It feels very, very good, and I've never been able to make this fail. I am aware that there's a couple of videos out there, one from the Late Boy Scout and one from Crockett 20, where a Blur fails on them. I'm not sure, you know, let me put it this way. If you Google SOG Aegis, you'll find like 80% of the videos about the Aegis will talk about blade play. That tells me blade play is a major issue. If you search Kershaw Blur, it's not 80% of the videos that say, hey, my Blur failed on me. In fact, you only find those two videos. And it's not good that the Blur failed, but I'm not sure that two videos indicate that the Blur has issues, especially when you consider the sheer number of Kershaw Blurs that have been sold. All right, I can tell you I have spine whacked mine, I've done overstrikes on mine, and I cannot get them to fail. And so I kind of feel like it's an anomaly, even though it is kind of a weird anomaly for that to happen to two fairly popular YouTubers. I don't know what to tell you. My experience has been nothing but positive with the lockup on the Kershaw Blur. Okay, although I do know that even just the other day I was talking to someone in a forum and they said, hey, I've been doing some research and I noticed that the Blur may have some lockup issues. And I said to them in reply, was your research to watch 2 YouTube videos? And they did admit, yeah, that's true. Okay, so I don't know that that qualifies as research, but I'm aware that that's out there. So when it comes to lockup, I'm going to give the edge to the Knockout, but I am not saying that the Kershaw Blur does not have a good lockup. I've said this repeatedly. My experience with the Blur and its lock has been nothing but positive. By the way, you should never use a locking knife as if it's a fixed blade anyway. So you should never, have your hands here and be putting any kind of negative pressure on that lock. Now, moving on to, so that's lockup and deployment. And I'm going to, as I say, give just a slight edge to the Knockout because I think that lock is just a little stronger and I think the deployment is just a little more explosive. Okay, what about the handle? Okay, handles on these both are very comfortable, both are aluminum, so again, very, very comparable. But I will say the Blur is, because of its extra thickness and because of those TrackTech inserts, it does feel a little nicer in hand, okay? Not a lot nicer, just a little nicer in hand. The grip feels, just a little more confidence inspiring. Now, the Knockout, it's still very comfortable. I've still used it a lot. I've never experienced any kind of discomfort. I've never thought, hey, I wish I had some other knife with me. I've always found it to be very, very comfortable, although many people have commented, and I will comment as well, that a little bit of grip tape or something of that nature, if they could put Track Tech in these grooves that they've created, I would kind of appreciate that, and I think a lot of other people would as well. Okay, so that is a drawback. And so for the handle, or for the ergonomics, I should say, I'm going to give the edge just slightly again to the Blur. Now, we've kind of been going back and forth. Blade, I like the Blur. Lockup and Deployment, I liked the Knockout. Handle, I'm going to say I like the Blur just a little better, although again, I think both of these are good. However, now here's one thing where the Knockout really stands out, and that is the pocket clip. Many people have complained that the pocket clip on the Blur is not great, and they're right, it's not. There's not enough space in here. It's kind of a weird angle. You can't get this fully into your pocket. It tends to stop somewhere around here, even though it looks like it should go all the way up to here. It just won't. The Track Tech under the clip is kind of a poor design idea. Okay, so all of that stuff is problematic when it comes to the Blur and its pocket clip. Now, on the other hand, the Kershaw Knockout is perfect. I kind of wish that every knife just had this pocket clip. Okay, it's deep carry, it is repositionable. Now, by the way, the Blur is only right side tip up, tip down. The Knockout is all four ways repositionable, and so I do think the clip is better on the Knockout. By the way, I carry both of these quite frequently, so it's not that I prefer one to such a great extent that I refuse to carry the other or anything like that. All right, now, the other thing we need to point out is that if you're the type of guy who likes something interesting and special and a little bit unique, you may be drawn more to the Blur because of the fact that the Blur has tons and tons of variations, all kinds of different steels, all kinds of different blade shapes, all kinds of different color schemes, and so there's just an endless amount of variation on the Kershaw Blur, and there are people who literally just collect Kershaw Blurs, and they've done a lot of very specialized and hard to find runs on the Kershaw Blur. The Knockout, they have this year done the Knockout with a brown handle and L-Max. It's also available, same steel 14C28N, but in a stonewash finish and a black handle. So there are some variations on the Knockout, but not nearly as many as the Blur. And even if they did decide they're going to do a bunch of different runs of the Knockout, it would take them years to catch up to the sheer number of options that are out there in the Blur. Okay, so variety, definitely the Blur is far and away beyond the Knockout, and the same is true, you can get this with different blade shapes and serrations and stuff like that, so that's something to think about. By the way, I'm just going to point out that this video is assuming the kind of standard Blur blade shape. My S30V Blur, for example, is a flat grind rather than a hollow grind, so just kind of FYI, I'm comparing these, but there are variations of the Blur that wouldn't kind of hold true to this video. All right, so overall, how would I say these two compare? Man, they're so close, and they're both great knives. I think whichever one you pick, you won't have gone far along. There are some matters about personal preference here. What kind of blade style do you like? Do you like the recurve or not the recurve? Do you think the sub frame lock just adds a whole lot of cool factor that a liner lock maybe doesn't have? Okay, those things are pretty subjective, and so those are things that may need to enter your thought process as you're deciding which one you prefer out of these. I'm going to say, as we compare these two, slightly more comfort in hand and a little more traction is what stands out for me on the Blur. And of course, I tend to really like that blade shape, although I know I'm kind of in the minority on that particular preference. On the other hand, the sub frame lock is really cool. The blade shape on this is really cool. And so there's also, and this one carries definitely in pocket better, not only because of the deep carry pocket clip, but because of the smooth handle. So, and it's thinner as well. So how all of those differences apply to you and what you think of each of those is really going to depend on which one you prefer overall. Since we've kind of worked through this, I said the blade, the blade went to the blur, the lockup and deployment went to the knockout, the handle went to the blur, the variations went to the blur, and so just by, you know, my kind of numerical comparison, the blur gets a bit of an edge, although there is one sort of negative factor, and that is the age of the blur. Okay, if you're one of those guys who likes to have the latest and greatest, you know, the blur has been around for a long time. Now, I think that speaks well to its design and to how much people love it, but you may say, hey, I'd rather have the newer knockout. So there's all the sort of things that enter my mind as I compare these two knives. I hope that helps you, and I hope you had fun just kind of watching this video about two knives that I really, really like. We'll talk to you later, guys.